Welcome back to another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And today we are continuing our series on my journal Techno Wizardry, my story of a new story of humanity. And I'm so sorry for the missing days, the long gap. They're not that long, but a couple days, missed a couple days there. Um, on Monday, I got myself a car. It's a old car. Almost 200,000 miles, but it runs, so I can get to work and get to where I need to go. Um, Check out my podcast for more details on that. but yeah. So over the past couple days was going through all that stuff, getting that situated, and have a lot of birthdays this month, this week. My mother's birthday was yesterday, so happy birthday to her. I mean, I just saw her the other day, but anyways, we continue our series on this episode. Um, Hopefully, I'll be able to do another this evening. I'm not sure though. I have a lot of stuff to do, um, but I did want to go ahead and do another one of these episodes. So today we're going to be talking about how hierarchy is a sickness. And if you recall, the last section we talked about was what life was actually like back in the days, and how it was not necessarily short, hard, and miserable. And in fact, our assuming so is a sort of uh, using the state propaganda, right, to make us believe that what we have today is so much better than what we had before, even though this the main difference is really just we have more conveniences, but not necessarily more fulfilling, lifestyles, or even healthier lifestyles in many ways. So, uh, being able to really critique, where we are and looking at history not as a linear thing, but as a sort of, branching process is a very powerful way of, just understanding where we are today. Anyways, today I'm going to get into problems of hierarchy. Finally, after 20 sections. Without further ado, let's get into it. Hierarchy is like a disease of the mind, of society. It infects the body of our consciousness and works to trick the cells that are our ideas into feeding the hierarchies and allowing it to grow unchecked, like a cancer, right? If not identified, it can turn our own immune system against us. This is why it's so hard to solve homelessness, racism, sexism, and so on. It's not because we are fighting against some human nature or that these are otherwise intractable problems. It's because these are just symptoms of the disease. And though it is important to alleviate these symptoms whenever possible, you will never cure a disease by just treating the symptoms. Furthermore, the very environment we have today is strongly biased towards hierarchies, towards centralizing bargaining power to fewer individuals at the cost of everyone else. Nearly all these isms and issues are a direct result of taking power away from many people to give it to fewer people. Therefore, claiming that the only way to solve these problems is by creating more hierarchies through economic, political, or technological means is just making everything worse, feeding the disease. But we're not dead. We can still fight it. And some of us have been fighting it, despite the fact that imperialist nations have been assassinating, sabotaging, or otherwise destroying nearly every attempt to decentralize power structures. There still exists quite a few strong antibodies against hierarchies. About to get into it. Even beyond the various socialist and anarchist initiatives, our very technology has quite a few tools against centralization of power as well. Though many technologies are not neutral and do bias the reinforcement of hierarchies, tools like the internet make it easier than ever to decentralize and distribute power. Or at least it can. Unfortunately, the monopolization of the internet has been steadily co opting that power, right? Making the internet dependent upon a few big tech companies or even governments just limits the power of individuals to live free and equal lives, such that only a few of those individuals have greater access to the internet or to the power of the internet than many others. I probably could have broke this down better. So basically, what I'm saying here, right? Oh, excuse me. Oh goodness, got burps now. Yeah, what I'm saying here is that what we're doing with the monopolization of the internet, creating these big tech companies, right, removes the freedom that we all have, removes the decentralization power, and it centralizes that power with the big tech companies, with governments, with people who have the tools and means to reinforce their power, their will, their desires or whatever upon everyone else. This whole idea of the marketplace is speaking, they literally can change the laws, the regulations to make it in their favor to win the game of capitalism, right? That's one of the biggest problems with what we have today. But before I get into these solutions and such, let me spend more time really breaking this down for the people in the back. But of course, at any point, if you haven't already, you can just skip to the end. So I'm going to continue since I haven't done a few episodes in a while. I'm only at 6 minutes. Technology is not neutral. Many technologies biased a certain group or type of person. Here's a few examples. The plow was a top-heavy device that made it harder for farm and thus required more male labor, which led to the idea that women couldn't do hard labor, even though women typically did most of the hard labor for many of these agricultural societies prior to that. Books were too expensive for the average person to own, much less access. So when knowledge began to get stored more in written form as opposed to oral, then there began a schism between those who could afford books and those who could not. Thus why a lot of older books sound completely arcane because they were written for other scholars, not the average person. I want to stand on this a little bit more because I've recently been getting more into this topic. Number one, this idea, like a lot of people read older books and like, oh, they were so much smarter than us, right? Look at all these big words like Hegel or whatever, or going further back, right? But what people seem to forget is that literacy is a very new thing, right? It was only in the early 1900s, or really later in the 1900s, when the average citizen was literate, was like we had high literacy rates, and that's even that is only for quote unquote developed nations, right? So for most of human history, most people could not read and did not need to read, right? So the people who were writing all these books that we're reading about history, right, were themselves extremely educated people, usually rich, entitled or have some, what's the term I'm looking for here? Goodness, privileges and stuff like that, right? They basically were able to have the time and money and occupation, right, to sit down and learn how to read and craft things. And so when they wrote books, when they wrote stories, whatever, it was only for other scholarly people. It was not for the average person. So this is similar to like an academic, a research paper, right, being written for other researchers, other scientists, which means it's going to be more difficult to read for the average person, even though the average person is, probably can understand these things. But if you, if you not dumb it down, technically dumb it down, but really just make it easier for the average person to read without all that jargon, right? Whenever you begin to write in a very technical manner, it sounds more educated, but really there's just more jargon there, right? Because you have more expertise in that specific field, whether it's a scientific field, philosophy, uh, uh, law, and stuff like that. So people need to remember that whenever we're talking about these older books. But another really big part to this, right, is the idea that civilization itself is only, cataloged, is only counted, right, as relevant once they establish a written form, like a written history, right? We call it prehistoric times versus the rest of times versus civilization, right? And that's actually a very discriminative, in a bad way, right? It's a very myopic way of viewing history, right? Just because a culture did not have written language did not necessarily mean that they were less complex, right? It does not mean that they were dumber or simpler or primitive or anything like that, right? They can have extremely complex ideas and mechanisms and all this stuff, but they do so orally, right? And oral is such a very powerful way of communicating knowledge. In fact, this is what we primarily do today with videos and audio, right? Is that's why podcasts and video essays and stuff like that is so popular, because oral communication is, I would argue, way more efficient at actually communicating than written form. Written form is primarily for record keeping, right? It's really good for record keeping. If you want to store knowledge for a long period of time or something like that in the exact way, sure, written record is fine. And of course, that's why a lot of our, archaeology is biased towards, written form, because that's what we can easily study. That's what's there, to find. But that does not mean that they were primitive, that they were, didn't have any complex civilization or stuff, And this is super important because a lot of these egalitarian cultures were more oral, right? Because that was a more egalitarian method of communication, right? Another aspect to this is that when you create a written language, you're not just, evolving your language, right? You're actually discriminating, right? You're actually choosing what language, what part of your language, right, to stratify, to codify, if you will. As you all know, like every language has a bunch of different dialects and nuance and context and things like that, right? So the way I'm talking now is familiar to where I live, but somebody who lives in a different region, might still speak English but have a different dialect, have a different way of pronouncing words, have a different way of even thinking to some levels, right? That's why you have this idea of Ebonics as its own language, rather than just slang, right? It's almost like it's basic. Many people would argue in this who are in the field of African American kind of language would argue that it's its own language. But when you create a written language, you're actually codifying a specific set. You're saying, okay, this is the right way of doing this language, of talking and communicating through this language. And furthermore, it also reduces the amount of context that you can put in, right? Because when you are talking, there's a lot of tonality that goes in place. There's body language. There's the overall environment. There's the speaker themselves and how they talk, the speed at which you talk, all this other stuff that goes into communicating. But when you write it down, you can't do all that. All you have left is just the bare minimum of the bare ideas. And because of that, there are some pros to that, but there's also a huge amount of cons, right? There's a lot of things that you're missing and losing out on when you're writing that language. And so the idea that written language is a advancement per se is not necessarily, I wouldn't say that's accurate. It's more like a branch. It's you oral is for certain purposes and written is for certain purposes. I wouldn't say put one above the other, unless you're talking about specific context, right? Of course, written is probably better for record keeping, but oral is better for storytelling and all this other stuff, right? So you got to really think about these things, but we don't really critique that often enough, and we don't really talk about that very much. So I wanted to touch on that, but let's continue. Cars were and still are quite expensive. Yes, I just had to buy an old ass car because not only because cars are expensive, but I didn't have credit history. That's a whole other thing. Go check out my podcast to talk about that too. It's really frustrating. Hard to maintain and require a lot of rethinking in urban planning. Messed it up too. So if you did not have the money to buy one, much less a car-friendly suburban house and car-centric roads, you couldn't participate in the burgeoning future of transportation. And as cities became more car dependent, walkable neighborhoods were demolished and paved over to make way for highways, suburbia, and parking lots. This destroyed the tax base of so many cities because car dependent areas are less dense and people can work or pay taxes in an area where they don't live in. That almost every car dependent city today is facing bankruptcy. Yeah, look it up. It's a huge problem that we're facing in America and many other places around the world that are car dependent. And another thing that's people aren't really talking about. The Luddites weren't a bunch of non-technical people, They were the mechanics and experts who knew the industrial age factory machines worked better than oh, sorry, I missed that word. Sorry. They were mechanics and experts who knew how the industrial age factory machines worked better than nearly anybody else. They understood that the existence of these amazing technologies would herald a devaluing of human labor. They knew that humans would be increasingly compared and in competition with the machines meant to make their lives easier. I've talked about this many times before. They saw way back in the 1800s that these machines would commoditize craftsmanship, destroy personality, and reduce humans to undesirable expenses in terms of like how a business, views their human capital. And many businesses are like kind of reluctant to hire people because it's super expensive to hire a person, especially full time. You have to pay insurance and all this other stuff and have PTO and stuff. I'm sure many of us can think back to a time when we work part time or hourly wages, or we still might work that time now. We know how terrible that is. And the businesses do that because it's cheaper for them, right? So they view the human labor not as a value in and of itself, as like, oh yeah, let's bring more people here, but as the fact that it's a huge expense and they want to cut down those expenses in order to improve their profits. They knew that the very art of production would be severely destroyed, such that most consumers won't even think about the sheer amount of work and effort put into every single thing that is produced. In a world where the means of production could be privatized without privatizing the humans themselves, the power balance would inevitably favor those that could capitalize on the owning of these machines. And real quick about this part, right? The sheer amount of work and effort that put into every single object. You see that with fast fashion, right? Most people don't even think about how hard and how much chemicals and stuff that goes into making clothes. But fast fashion, because you have all these sweatshops and machines and facilities, manufacturing facilities, they can pump out, all these new clothes, new fashion every year, every month, really. And at the same token, you see cars. Like, why do we have brand new cars every single year? Right? What's the difference between a 2022 Kia and a 2021? Right? Like, it's not that much different. And many times they barely even change anything. They just slap a new name on that thing. But you have to manufacture new cars every single year for some reason. Right? It's really ridiculous. Just like we see today with data, the sanctity of privacy and attention of user behavior and custom refined knowledge is being commoditized. Capitalists claim it's just automatic data crunching, that there is no value in the data without their algorithms. But what is really happening is a retardation of our ability to personalize, curate, and process information. I'm using that word as like it's actually intended. AI is the 21st century version of those factory machines, sucking up tons of raw materials exploited from the environment, that is, our minds and behaviors, and crunching it up to churn out products. It doesn't even matter about the quality or innovation of these products. The fact of the matter is that they inherently strongly bias the few individuals who have the money, connections, luck, or sometimes skill to capitalize on this technology to gain more power at the expense of everyone else. People love to claim that without capitalism, we wouldn't have innovation. But we've had innovation for thousands of years without it. And furthermore, we have to ask ourselves if we actually want innovation in general or actual quality of life improvements where it matters. Do you want people to just innovate like how they make money off you? Just look at freaking mobile gaming, right? There's plenty of innovation in monetization schemes, but most of us don't really enjoy that, right? It's that's not the innovation that we're looking for. It's not the Jedi, whatever. The intrinsic problem with automation, whether it be as simple as traffic lights, as factories, or as abstract machine learning algorithms, is the outsourcing of human intelligence to machines, which often is indeed more convenient, but comes at the cost of our ability to exercise said intelligence. So we aren't doing those skills, right? And great, yes, a robot can do it now, but now what do we do? Like, I'm not one for like the idea that robots are replacing humans and blah blah blah. My thing here is that if a robot is doing what we used to do, are we still using those skills? And what happened to those skills in our minds? Like what happens to the fact that we don't exercise these navigation skills? For instance, when you're driving, right? If you're always looking at a map, do you have navigation skills? And there's been a lot of research that's been showing that skills like these are in fact um, decreasing, right? Navigation skills, for instance, because people are always looking on a map or something like that. um, you have like cooking skills, even to an extent. You have social skills. That's a huge problem. All right, most of us don't even have like 5 friends we can depend on, much even though we have a thousand followers or a couple hundred followers or even millions of followers in some instances. Like it's ridiculous. Negotiation skills, right? Because there's on everything, we don't really negotiate the price, and we don't really think about how much effort went into a thing, and now having a relationship with the buyer or with the seller and stuff like that. It's really concerning. Sometimes this is sometimes this is an acceptable trade-off, but oftentimes we actually lose very important skills without realizing it, such as spatial reasoning, memory, attention spans, and much more. As we've seen over the last few decades, automation does not even necessarily grant us more space or time for leisure and reaching human potential. That was the whole idea of automation 100 years ago. Now look at us. Most people still work 40, 50, 60, even 80 hours a week, right? And not necessarily by choice, but because they feel like they have to in order to survive out here, right? Is that the dream that we're supposed to be happy about with automation? Is that the progress that we're supposed to be thankful for? Many of the best technologies we value today were not for the purpose of profit or other capitalist means, but due to open source communities who wanted to create something cool or solve a problem or even fight back against privatization. Some of the big names include ARPANET, Linux or Linux, Android, Firefox, Chromium, Blender, OBS. Innovation is society agnostic. We can have plenty of innovation and technological advances without also exploiting resources to hell and biasing all the power towards a few individuals or corporations. It's clear that even the project of doing good science is handicapped by a capitalistic hierarchical mindset. The very concept of peer review is an egalitarian ideal. But the current landscape locks up access to scientific research and journals to the point that only people who have the privilege of going to a high-end institution can do science. All that to say, the technologies, before I get that, like this actually even more concerning efforts about this, where people have been pointing out that a lot of the science that's been done over the past decades or so has been incredibly biased because it's been bankrolled by corporate interests, by lobbyists, by people who wanted to create a certain idea around their product, right? To try and drum up more support or research or whatever in the specific field that proves that their product is the best thing, even though there's a huge amount of other problems associated. And in fact, there's a huge reporting problem where oftentimes scientists would do some research and they would discover something about, let's say a drug, for instance, right? They discover a bunch of side effects for the drug. And they're like, don't report that. That's not really important. That's not the part of this research that we're focusing on, right? We're focusing on this. We're paying you for this, right? So all that stuff that happens about, like all these side effects may not be, being reported as they should be. Now, granted, I'm using a loose example here because there's a lot of, regulations in specific drugs, but it still is true for a lot of different types of drugs, and more so true for things like algorithms, for things like mechanics, things like everyday products like child toys and even therapy and stuff like that. Like there's a lot of places in which we commoditize products, and there's been scientific like research in this where either scientific research that has been ignored and not supported, or scientific research that's not allowed to happen, right? Like doesn't get any support. Like somebody wants to research something that they think is probably going to be really important, but nobody would fund that research, right? Because they don't want to know, they don't want to, go in that route, and so they don't fund the research, and therefore we lose a lot of that knowledge. We don't gain, or rather, we don't gain that knowledge that we should be having. And there's a lot of other, aspects to this too, and it's really concerning when you realize that. All that to say, the technologies and modern day conveniences you enjoy most of the day are either here despite capitalism and hierarchy, or are only possible due to the gross exploitation of less fortunate peoples. So is it really progress, right? I'll probably end it there because I think this is a longer section, but hopefully we can continue tonight or tomorrow. And it's just, we have to be way more critical, people, of the quote unquote, modern day life of saying how advanced we are with today's living, just because we have this house and calendars with cool colors and computers and everything like that, doesn't necessarily mean that we're getting the best that we should be getting, right? That we're getting the best that we can be getting, right? Just because we have certain privileges and conveniences and stuff like that, luxuries even, doesn't mean that's necessarily good for us, right? Sweets are good. They're yummy. They're very tasty. I love me some sweets, but they're not healthy, right? And you can seriously mess yourself up by eating too many sweets or engaging in that sort of thing. And unfortunately, that's how our entire society is, where we see all these things. We say, "Oh yes, it's good. It's good. It's making me feel good." It's pretty much the hedonistic, treadmill or whatever they call it, right? Where it makes you feel good, but it's not actually good for you. So we really have to be critical about, the times we live in, the technologies that we have, the um, type of society that we use, the democracy that we quote unquote, cat for, and the freedom that we say we want. Like, is that really freedom? Is this democracy actual democracy? How can we make it better? And all this, and so on. Like, the more that we question these things and truly delve into what this looks like and what this can be and where this came from and the narratives that's being said and all this other stuff, right? The more we actually think about these things, the more we can figure out more holistic, more cohesive, a better, more free, right, environment and life, more healthy and all that other stuff. So I just want us to do better, man. I think we can do better, and I think a big step towards doing better is knowledge, is learning, is critiquing, is asking questions and stuff like that. So I hope I'm accomplishing that here, and I hope you are learning alongside with me. As always, if you have any ideas or questions or concerns, or think I'm wrong about anything, we can have a discussion in the comments. Um, and as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.